The scent of old books and leather filled the private library, where Elena Alves spent most of her evenings. At 28, she had carved out a quiet existence cataloging rare manuscripts for the Vieira estate, a sprawling compound in the hills overlooking Boston. The work suited her, methodical, solitary, requiring precision and patience. It was the kind of job where she could disappear into the whisper of aged paper and the scratch of her pen, where the outside world with its noise and chaos couldn't reach her. Except for him. Bruno Vieira had a way of shattering her carefully maintained solitude without even trying. At 36, he moved through the world with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, who had built an empire from shadows and steel. His presence filled a room before he entered it, an electricity that made the air vibrate with unspoken warnings. When he walked into the library that October evening, Elena felt it in her spine. That familiar tightening, the way her breath caught despite her best efforts to remain professional. "You're still here," he observed, his voice carrying that slight rasp that came from too many late nights and too much whiskey. He wore a charcoal suit with the jacket unbuttoned, his white shirt open at the collar, sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked with the kind of strength that came from more than gym workouts. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it, and his eyes, those impossible dark eyes that saw too much, fixed on her with an intensity that made her hands tremble against the manuscript she'd been examining. "The Medici collection requires careful attention," Elena replied, keeping her gaze on the delicate pages before her. "I wanted to finish cataloging this volume before the weekend." Bruno moved closer, and she caught his scent, sandalwood and something darker, something that reminded her of smoke and secrets. He stopped beside her desk, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, close enough that if she turned her head, she would be looking directly at the place where his shirt opened to reveal the hollow of his throat. "Always so dedicated," he murmured, and there was something in his voice that made her finally look up. His expression was unreadable, that careful mask he wore in public slipping just enough to reveal something raw beneath. "That's what I've always admired about you, Elena. Your ability to focus on what matters." Her heart hammered against her ribs. They had been dancing around this for 2 years. Stolen glances across crowded rooms. Conversations that lasted too long to be merely professional. Moments when his hand would brush hers as he passed her a rare volume, and the contact would send electricity coursing through her entire body. She had told herself it was nothing, that men like Bruno Vieira didn't notice women like her, that she was simply another employee in his vast network of business interests. But she had been lying to herself. "Mr. Vieira," she began, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "Bruno," he corrected, as he had 100 times before. "When it's just us, it's Bruno." "Bruno," she amended, the name feeling dangerously intimate on her tongue. "I should finish this. It's getting late." Instead of leaving, he reached out and gently closed the manuscript she'd been working on. His fingers were long and elegant, despite the calluses she knew were there, despite the violence those hands were capable of. "It's after midnight, Elena. The Medicis can wait." She swallowed hard, acutely aware of how alone they were, how the rest of the house had gone silent hours ago. The library felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. "What are you doing here? I thought you had that meeting in the city." "It finished early." He leaned against her desk, arms crossed, studying her with an expression that made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed. "I came back and saw the light still on. I wanted to make sure you weren't working yourself to exhaustion." "I'm fine," she said, but her voice betrayed her, coming out softer than she intended. "Are you?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. His gaze dropped to her hands, which she'd clasped together to hide their shaking. "Elena, look at me." She did, and immediately regretted it. The careful distance she had maintained for 2 years, crumbled in the face of what she saw in his eyes. Desire, yes, but also something deeper, something that terrified her more than attraction ever could. "I can't keep pretending," Bruno said, his voice low and rough, "that you're just my archivist, that I don't notice every time you walk into a room, that I don't find excuses to come to this library just to hear your voice." He pushed off from the desk, moving around it to stand before her chair. "Tell me I'm alone in this. Tell me you feel nothing and I'll leave. I'll maintain the professional distance you clearly prefer. But if there's even a chance..." Elena stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. She should have stepped back, should have put distance between them, but instead she found herself frozen, looking up at him as he towered over her. At 5'6", she had never felt particularly small, but Bruno made her feel delicate in a way that should have been unsettling, but somehow wasn't. "You know what you are," she whispered. "What you do, the world you live in. Why would you want to drag me into that?" "I don't," he said simply. "I want to keep you separate from it, safe from it." His hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, before his fingers traced the line of her jaw with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. "But I can't stop thinking about you. Can't stop wanting this." When he kissed her, it was with a restraint that spoke volumes about the control he maintained over himself, over everything in his life. His lips were soft against hers, questioning rather than demanding, and Elena felt something inside her chest crack open. She had spent 2 years building walls, convincing herself that this couldn't happen, shouldn't happen. Those walls crumbled to dust in the space of a heartbeat. Her hands came up to grip the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, and Bruno made a sound low in his throat that sent heat flooding through her body. The kiss deepened, became something urgent and necessary, and Elena lost herself in the taste of him, whiskey and mint, and something darker that she couldn't name but wanted more of. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Bruno rested his forehead against hers. "Tell me this isn't just me," he said, and there was a vulnerability in his voice that she had never heard before, that she suspected few people ever heard. "It's not just you," Elena admitted, her voice barely audible. "It's never been just you." That night marked the beginning of something Elena knew was dangerous but couldn't resist. Bruno was careful, always so careful, keeping their relationship hidden from his business associates, from the world that wouldn't understand. Their time together existed in stolen moments, late nights in the library that turned into early mornings, weekends at a private cabin upstate where they could pretend to be normal people without the weight of his empire pressing down on them, quiet dinners in the penthouse apartment he kept separate from his business dealings. Elena learned the man beneath the reputation, discovered that Bruno Vieira collected rare books not for status, but because he genuinely loved them, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, that he was unfailingly gentle with her even as she saw glimpses of the ruthlessness he showed the rest of the world. She learned that his father had built the family empire through blood and fear, and Bruno had inherited both the kingdom and the crown of thorns that came with it. "I never wanted this life," he told her one night, as they lay tangled together in his bed, the lights of Boston spreading below them like scattered diamonds. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "My father gave me no choice. By the time I was old enough to understand what we really did, I was already too deep to walk away." "Do you want to?" Elena asked, turning to look at him. "Walk away?" Bruno's expression shuddered, that careful mask sliding back into place. "It's not that simple. There are people who depend on me, families whose livelihoods are tied to the organization. Walking away would create a power vacuum that would tear this city apart." Elena said nothing, simply pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. She understood, even if she didn't like it, that Bruno saw himself as responsible for maintaining a certain order, however violent. It was a rationalization, perhaps, but she had learned that people rarely saw themselves as villains in their own stories. For 2 years, they built something together in the shadows. Elena continued her work with the rare book collection, and Bruno continued running an empire that existed in the gray spaces between legal and illegal. They carved out a sanctuary in the midst of chaos, a private world where they could simply be Bruno and Elena, without titles or expectations or the weight of his family name. But sanctuaries, Elena would learn, were fragile things. The night everything changed started like any other. Elena was working late in the library, finishing up some correspondence about a potential acquisition. She heard raised voices from Bruno's office down the hall. Not unusual, as business discussions often grew heated. But something about the tone made her pause, made her listen. "You're getting sloppy, Bruno." The voice belonged to Leon Santos, Bruno's right hand, a man whose loyalty was absolute, but whose judgment was often brutal. "This woman is a distraction you can't afford." Elena's blood ran cold. "My personal life is not your concern." Bruno's voice was tight with warning. "It is when it affects your decision-making," Leon countered. "The Boston crew is asking questions. The Irish are getting bold because they think you're distracted. And that business with the shipment last month. You hesitated, Bruno. You never hesitate. One delayed decision does not mean. It means you're thinking about something other than the organization," Leon interrupted. "It means you're vulnerable. And in our world, vulnerability gets people killed. You need to end this, whatever it is, before it becomes a problem we can't control." Silence stretched, and Elena held her breath, waiting for Bruno to defend what they had, to tell Leon that his personal life was exactly that. Personal. Instead, she heard a heavy sigh. "You're right," Bruno said, and those 2 words felt like a knife between Elena's ribs. "I'll handle it." She didn't wait to hear more. She returned to her desk, hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her pen, and tried to focus on the manuscript before her. But the words blurred together, meaningless, and all she could think about was the resignation in Bruno's voice, the way he had capitulated so quickly to Leon's demands. When Bruno appeared in the library doorway an hour later, Elena already knew what was coming. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the careful blankness of his expression. He had put his armor back on, had become once again the man the world saw rather than the one she knew. "We need to talk," he said. And even his voice had changed, gone cold and remote. Elena set down her pen with deliberate care. "I heard." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or relief that he wouldn't have to explain. "Then you understand." "No," she said, standing to face him. "I understand what Leon said. What I don't understand is why you agreed with him." Bruno's jaw tightened. "Because he's right. This," he gestured between them, "is a liability I can't afford. I've been selfish, keeping you close when I knew it put you at risk. When I knew it put everything at risk. I'm not asking you to choose me over your responsibilities," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've never asked that. You don't have to ask." He took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it and stopped. "Just being near me puts you in danger. The people I deal with, they don't have boundaries, don't respect the line between business and personal. If they knew about you, if they wanted to hurt me, they would use you without hesitation." "Then we're more careful," Elena argued, even though she could see the decision was already made, could see it in every rigid line of his body. No. The word was final, absolute. "This ends tonight. You'll continue your work with the collection, but that's all it will be. Work. Professional. Distant. What we had, it's over." Elena felt something crack inside her chest, a clean break that would leave scars. Just like that? 2 years? And you're walking away because Leon told you to? I'm walking away because keeping you in my life is selfish, Bruno said. And for just a moment, the mask slipped, and she saw pain raw and honest in his eyes. Because I care about you too much to let you become collateral damage in my world. She wanted to argue, to fight, to make him see that she was capable of making her own choices about what risks to take. But looking at him, at the rigid set of his shoulders, the careful blankness he'd pulled over his features like a shield, Elena realized that this wasn't really about protecting her. It was about protecting himself, about maintaining the control he needed to run his empire without the complication of caring about someone who could be hurt. Forget you ever loved me, Bruno said, and his voice was steel now. The voice he used when giving orders he expected to be followed. That's not a request, Elena. It's for your own good. You don't get to decide what's good for me, she whispered, but even she could hear the defeat in her own words. Bruno moved to the door, then paused, his back to her. Your position here is secure. The work you've done with the collection is exceptional, and I won't punish you for my mistakes. But we maintain professional boundaries from now on. Is that clear? Elena wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him look at her and see what he was doing. Instead, she straightened her spine and met his gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. Perfectly clear, Mr. Vieira. Something in his expression splintered at her use of his formal name, but he recovered quickly. With a curt nod, he left, and Elena was alone in the library that had once been their sanctuary. She sank back into her chair, staring at the closed door, and tried to understand how 2 years could end in the space of a 5-minute conversation. That night, Elena cried for the first time in years. Not the delicate tears of heartbreak, but the kind of soul-deep sobbing that left her hollow and exhausted. She mourned not just the loss of Bruno, but the loss of what she'd thought they were building, the future she'd allowed herself to imagine in her weakest moments. By morning, she had made her decision. She would stay, would continue her work with the collection, but she would build walls so high and thick that Bruno Vieira would never again be able to reach the part of her that had loved him. She would be professional, competent, utterly untouchable. If he wanted distance, she would give him a distance so complete it would feel like she'd never existed in his life at all. The first weeks after Bruno ended things were the hardest Elena had ever endured. She showed up to work each day, cataloged manuscripts with mechanical precision, and avoided the main house whenever possible. The library became less a sanctuary and more a tomb, beautiful and quiet and suffocating in its memories of what had been. Bruno kept his word about maintaining professional boundaries. When they crossed paths, which happened less and less frequently as the weeks turned into months, he was unfailingly polite and utterly remote. He addressed her as Miss Alves, asked about her progress on various projects, in the same tone he might use with any employee, and never once allowed his mask to slip. Elena matched him coldness for coldness, professionalism for professionalism. She learned to steel herself against the sight of him, to ignore the way her heart still raced when he walked into a room, to pretend she didn't notice the shadows under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping any better than she was. Her best friend Clara noticed the change immediately. Over coffee at their usual Sunday morning cafe, Clara studied Elena with eyes that saw too much. You look terrible, Clara said bluntly. She was an art gallery owner with a sharp eye for detail and zero patience for polite lies. Like you haven't slept in weeks. What's going on? Elena stirred her coffee, watching the cream swirl into patterns that dissolved as quickly as they formed. Nothing. Just busy with work. Liar. Clara leaned back, crossing her arms. I've known you for 10 years, Elena. You don't get that look in your eyes from working too hard. You get it from heartbreak. The word hung between them, and Elena felt her carefully maintained composure crack. She told Clara everything. About Bruno. About the 2 years they'd hidden their relationship. about how it had ended with such brutal finality. "Men," Clara spat when Elena finished, her expression a mixture of sympathy and fury. "Especially men like him, with their codes and their pride and their stupid noble sacrifices. He threw away something real because he was afraid." "He said it was to protect me," Elena said quietly. "And you believe that?" Elena considered the question. Did she believe Bruno had ended things to protect her? Yes, in part. But she also believed he'd done it to protect himself, to maintain the iron control he needed over every aspect of his life. Love made people vulnerable, and vulnerability was a luxury Bruno Vieira couldn't afford. "It doesn't matter why," Elena said finally. "It's over. I just need to move on." But moving on proved harder than she'd anticipated. Boston was a city that belonged to the Vieira family in ways both visible and invisible. She saw reminders of Bruno everywhere. In the restaurants that bore his family name, in the social pages where his photograph appeared at charity galas, in the whispered conversations about mob business that she couldn't help overhearing in coffee shops and grocery stores. 6 months after the breakup, Elena made a decision. She would leave the Vieira estate, leave the library and the manuscripts and the ghosts that haunted every room. She began quietly searching for other positions, sending out carefully worded inquiries to private collectors and academic institutions. But every opportunity seemed to evaporate the moment her references were checked. Positions that had seemed promising would suddenly be filled. Interviews would be canceled without explanation. It took Elena 3 frustrating months to realize what was happening. Bruno was blocking her, using his influence to keep her exactly where she was. She confronted him on a cold March afternoon, catching him as he was leaving his office for a meeting in the city. Leon stood nearby, always the shadow, but Elena ignored him, focusing all her attention on Bruno. "We need to talk," she said, keeping her voice level despite the anger simmering beneath her skin. "Privately." Bruno's expression remained carefully neutral. "Miss Alvis, if this is about the collection, it's about the fact that every job I apply for mysteriously disappears," she interrupted, not caring that Leon was listening, not caring who might overhear. "It's about you using your influence to trap me here." Something flickered in Bruno's eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or annoyance at being called out. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Elena said, stepping closer. "I've been doing this work long enough to know when someone's interfering, and the only person with enough reach to blacklist me across multiple institutions is standing right in front of me." Bruno's jaw tightened. "Leon, give us a moment." His second-in-command hesitated, then nodded and moved out of earshot. Once they were alone, or as alone as they could be in a hallway where anyone might walk by, Bruno's careful mask cracked just enough for Elena to see the frustration beneath. "You want to leave," he said flatly. "I need to leave," Elena corrected. "Staying here, seeing you, pretending we were never anything. It's killing me, Bruno. So yes, I want to leave. I deserve the chance to build a life somewhere that doesn't remind me of what I lost." "And if I told you it's not safe?" His voice dropped lower, more urgent. "That there are people who still ask about you, who remember seeing us together? That removing my protection would leave you vulnerable?" Elena laughed, a brittle sound. "So what's the alternative? I stay here forever, trapped in a job I can no longer stand, watching you from a distance and pretending it doesn't hurt? That's not protection, Bruno. That's a prison." "It's temporary," he insisted, "just until the situation stabilizes." "It's been 9 months," Elena said. "How much longer? A year? 5 years? The rest of my life?" She shook her head. "I can't do this anymore. I won't." Bruno ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she remembered from their time together. "What do you want from me, Elena?" "Let me go," she whispered. "Really let me go." Stop interfering with my job applications. Stop watching me. Give me the chance to move on with my life." For a long moment, Bruno said nothing, just studied her with those dark eyes that saw too much. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. I'll make some calls, undo whatever damage has been done. You'll have your opportunities." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a strange sense of loss. This was it, the final severing of whatever connection had remained between them. "Thank you." "Elena." He reached out as if to touch her, then let his hand fall. "For what it's worth, I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," she said, and realized she meant it. Bruno had made choices he thought were necessary, had prioritized duty over desire in a way that was probably inevitable, given who he was. Understanding that didn't make it hurt less, but it did make it easier to let go. "Goodbye, Bruno." She didn't wait for his response, just turned and walked away, her spine straight and her eyes dry. Later, alone in her apartment, she would cry. But in that moment, she needed him to see her strength, needed him to know that she would survive this, would thrive beyond it. True to his word, Bruno removed whatever obstacles he'd placed in her path. Within 2 weeks, Elena had 3 solid job offers. She chose a position at a private library in Providence, Rhode Island, far enough from Boston to feel like a fresh start, close enough that she wouldn't be completely uprooting her life. Her last day at the Vieira estate fell on a gray April morning. Elena packed up her personal belongings from the library, a few books Bruno had given her, photographs of rare manuscripts she'd catalogued, notes from 2 years of meticulous work. The room felt cavernous without her presence in it, and she wondered who would take over the collection, whether they would love these books the way she had. She was loading the last box into her car when Bruno appeared. He wore a black suit, despite the casual hour, and his expression was as carefully blank as it had been for the past 9 months. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," he said, keeping a careful distance between them. Elena closed her trunk, then turned to face him. In the pale morning light, she could see new lines around his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. "I do. Thank you. The Providence Library is lucky to have you," Bruno said. It might have been a simple pleasantry, except for the way his voice caught on the words, a hairline fracture in his composure. "And you'll find another archivist," Elena replied. "Someone without complications." "Elena..." He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "I want you to know that if circumstances were different, if I were different..." "Don't," she interrupted gently. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." Bruno nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. For a moment, they simply stood there, 2 people who had loved each other in secret and lost each other in silence. Then, Elena got into her car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. In her rearview mirror, she saw Bruno standing in the driveway, watching her leave. The image grew smaller and smaller until he disappeared entirely, and Elena allowed herself one final moment of grief for what might have been. Then she focused on the road ahead, on the future she would build with her own hands, and refused to look back again. Providence welcomed Elena with rain-washed streets and the smell of the ocean. The private library where she'd taken a position was housed in a renovated mansion overlooking the river, its collections spanning 4 centuries of American history. The work was engaging, the staff friendly without being intrusive, and for the first time in months, Elena felt like she could breathe without the weight of memory pressing down on her chest. She rented a small apartment in the historic district, within walking distance of the library. The space was modest, a 1-bedroom with creaking floors and windows that rattled in the wind. But it was hers, untainted by associations with Bruno, or the life she'd left behind in Boston. Slowly, painfully, Elena began to rebuild herself, She established routines that had nothing to do with avoiding anyone or maintaining professional distance. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, Tuesday evenings at a bookshop that hosted readings, Friday nights with Clara, who drove down from Boston once a month for dinner and wine and conversations that didn't revolve around heartbreak. "You're looking better," Clara observed during one of these visits, nearly a year after Elena had left Boston. They were sharing a bottle of Chianti at a small Italian restaurant, and Clara studied Elena with the critical eye of someone who had watched her friend's slow recovery from the beginning. "Your eyes don't look quite so haunted." Elena smiled, realizing it was true. "I'm getting there. Some days are still hard, but they're fewer now." "Have you heard from him at all?" "No," Elena said, and the word didn't hurt quite as much as it once had. "And I don't expect to." Bruno made his choice. Clara swirled her wine thoughtfully. "You know what I think? I think he's probably miserable without you." "Or he's moved on completely," Elena countered. "You know how he is, compartmentalizes everything. Our relationship was just one box, and he closed it." "Maybe," Clara allowed. "But I've seen the way he looked at you, Elena. That's not something you just turn off." Elena changed the subject, unwilling to spend their limited time together dissecting Bruno's possible emotional state. She'd spent too many nights doing exactly that, imagining him in the penthouse they'd shared on weekends, wondering if he ever thought about her, if he regretted his decision. Those thoughts led nowhere productive, only to the kind of circular pain that kept wounds from healing. As the seasons turned and Elena settled more fully into her new life, she found herself thinking about Bruno less frequently. The sharp edges of grief had worn down to something more like wistful sadness, still there, but no longer cutting her with every breath. She dated occasionally, nothing serious. A professor from Brown University who talked too much about himself. A gallery owner who was charming but ultimately forgettable. A journalist who was interesting until he started asking pointed questions about her time working for the Vieira family. Elena ended that one quickly, unwilling to become someone's source for a story about organized crime. It was during her second year in Providence that Elena met Mario Suarez. She was at the library late one evening, working on cataloging a newly acquired collection of letters from a Revolutionary War general. The main doors had been locked for hours, and she was alone except for the security guard making his rounds. So when she heard footsteps approaching her workspace, she looked up in surprise. The man standing in the doorway was in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He wore a well-tailored suit, but there was something approachable about him, a warmth that put Elena immediately at ease. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice carrying a faint accent she couldn't quite place. "The security guard let me in. I'm Mario Suarez, a donor to the library. I wanted to see the Revolutionary War collection before the exhibition opens next month." Elena set down her pen, rising to greet him. "Elena Alves, head archivist. The collection is still being processed, but I'd be happy to show you what we have so far." What began as a professional courtesy evolved into a 2-hour conversation about history, preservation, and the stories contained in old letters. Mario was a widower, Elena learned, his wife having died 3 years earlier from cancer. He had channeled his grief into philanthropy, supporting libraries and museums throughout New England. "My wife loved history," he said at one point, running gentle fingers over the edge of a letter dated 1776. She would have been thrilled to see these preserved and shared with the public. There was no self-pity in his voice, just honest sadness and genuine appreciation for the work Elena was doing. She found herself warming to him, appreciating his thoughtful questions and his clear respect for the materials. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" Mario asked as he prepared to leave. "I'd love to hear more about your work. And if I'm being honest, I'd also just enjoy the company." Elena hesitated, but something about Mario's straightforward kindness made her say yes. They met for coffee the following Saturday at a cafe near the waterfront. The conversation flowed easily, touching on books and travel and the small details that made up daily life. Mario didn't ask intrusive questions about her past, didn't push for information she wasn't ready to share. Their second coffee date led to dinner, which led to walks along the river, which gradually evolved into something that felt like the beginning of a relationship. Mario was patient, never rushing her, always giving Elena space to move at her own pace. He had a successful import business. Legitimate, she was relieved to learn, with no shadows or secrets lurking beneath the surface. "I like you, Elena," Mario told her one evening, as they stood on the pedestrian bridge watching the sunset paint the river in shades of gold and crimson. "I like the way you talk about books like they're old friends. I like your laugh. I like that you don't need me to fill every silence." He turned to look at her, his expression open and honest. "I know you've been hurt before. I don't need to know the details. I just want you to know that I'm not in a rush. We can take this as slowly as you need." Elena looked at this kind, patient man who had appeared in her life without demands or complications, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the overwhelming rush of feeling she'd experienced with Bruno, but something gentler, something that felt like it might be sustainable. "I'd like that," she said softly. Taking it slow sounds perfect. As their relationship deepened over the following months, Elena found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She told Mario about Bruno, not everything, but enough, that she'd been in love with someone who couldn't give her what she needed, that the ending had been painful but necessary, that she'd moved to Providence to escape the memories. Mario listened without judgment, without trying to fix or analyze. "We all have pasts," he said simply. "What matters is who we choose to be going forward." It was this quality, this ability to accept without needing to possess, to care without needing to control, that made Elena fall for Mario Suarez. Not with the desperate intensity she'd felt for Bruno, but with a steady warmth that felt like coming home after a long journey through cold and dark. When Mario asked her to marry him, on a crisp October evening during their third autumn together, Elena said yes without hesitation. She loved this man who had shown her that relationships could be built on honesty and respect, who had never asked her to be anyone other than who she was. They planned a simple wedding, a ceremony at a small historic church in Providence, followed by a reception at a restaurant overlooking the harbor. Clara would be her maid of honor. Mario's business partner Fabio would serve as best man. No massive guest list, no elaborate production, just a celebration of two people who had found each other after loss. "Are you happy?" Clara asked during a fitting for bridesmaid dresses, studying Elena's reflection in the mirror. "Really, truly happy?" Elena considered the question, running her hands over the ivory silk of her wedding gown. Was she happy? Yes, she realized. Maybe not in the wild, all-consuming way she'd been happy with Bruno, but in a quieter, more sustainable way. Mario made her laugh. He respected her work. He never made her feel like she was a liability or a distraction. With him, she could simply be Elena, without the weight of secrets and shadows. "Yes," she told Clara. "I really am." The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect New England autumn days where the air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Elena dressed carefully in her simple gown, let Clara style her hair in a loose updo, and tried to ignore the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "You look beautiful," Clara said, stepping back to admire her work. "Mario's going to lose his mind when he sees you." Elena smiled at her reflection, seeing a woman who had survived heartbreak and built a new life. A woman who was ready to move forward, to commit to a future that didn't involve hiding or pretending or living in fear of the other shoe dropping. She was ready. She was happy. She was going to marry a good man who loved her, and if a small part of her heart still belonged to someone else, well, that was something she'd learned to live with. some losses you didn't recover from. You just learned to carry them. The church was small and beautiful, filled with late afternoon light that slanted through stained glass windows. Elena stood in the vestibule, her arm linked through Clara's, waiting for the music to begin. Through the partially open doors, she could see Mario standing at the altar, looking nervous and excited and everything a groom should be. The music started, a string quartet playing Pachelbel's canon, and the doors swung fully open. Elena took a deep breath, preparing to walk down the aisle toward her future. Then she saw him. Bruno Vieira stood in the back pew, and the sight of him hit Elena like a physical blow. He wore a dark suit, his hair slightly longer than she remembered, and his expression was completely unreadable. But his eyes, those dark eyes she'd tried so hard to forget, were fixed on her with an intensity that made the rest of the church fade into background noise. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Elena froze, her carefully constructed composure threatening to shatter. What was he doing here? How had he even known about the wedding? Then her training, her pride, her determination not to let him affect her anymore, kicked in. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and began walking down the aisle. Not to Bruno, not to the past, but toward Mario, toward the future she'd chosen for herself. As she passed Bruno's pew, Elena allowed herself one brief glance in his direction. Their eyes met, held for a heartbeat, and she saw something raw and broken in his expression. Too late, she thought. You're too late. Then she looked away and continued walking, her steps steady and sure, toward the man waiting for her at the altar. Elena's steps echoed in the quiet church as she made her way down the aisle, each footfall a deliberate choice to move forward. She could feel Bruno's gaze burning into her back, could sense the tension radiating from where he stood, but she refused to falter, refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing that his presence had shaken her. Mario's face as she approached was everything good and honest, joy and love, and a hint of relieved laughter that she'd actually appeared, that this was really happening. When she reached him and placed her hand in his fingers were warm and steady, grounding her in the present moment. The officiant began speaking, words about love and commitment that Elena had heard at countless weddings, but that felt newly significant now. She repeated her vows in a clear voice, slipped the ring onto Mario's finger, and accepted his gentle kiss with genuine affection. Through it all, she was acutely aware of Bruno's presence in the back of the church, a shadow she couldn't quite ignore no matter how hard she tried to focus on the man she was marrying. The reception was held at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, the kind of elegant but unpretentious venue that suited both Elena and Mario perfectly. The space was decorated simply: white flowers, candles, fairy lights strung overhead that would twinkle when evening fell. About 50 guests mingled, sipping champagne and sampling hors d'oeuvres. Elena circulated through the crowd on Mario's arm, accepting congratulations and well wishes from colleagues and friends. She was laughing at something one of Mario's business associates said when she felt it again, that prickling awareness that meant Bruno was nearby. She turned and found him standing near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching her with that same unreadable expression. He'd removed his suit jacket, and his shirt was open at the collar, the sleeves rolled to his elbows in that way that had always made her pulse quicken. Even now, even after everything, her body betrayed her with its reaction to him. "Who's that?" Mario asked, following her gaze. "I don't recognize him from the guest list." Elena's throat went dry. "Bruno Vieira, my former employer." Mario's eyebrows rose slightly. "From Boston? I didn't realize you'd invited him." "I didn't," Elena said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "He must have found out somehow." Before Mario could respond, Clara appeared at Elena's elbow, her expression troubled. "We need to talk," she murmured, nodding toward the ladies' room. "Now." Elena excused herself, following Clara through the crowded restaurant. Once they were alone in the powder room, Clara turned to her with a mixture of concern and barely suppressed fury. "What the hell is he doing here?" Clara demanded. "Did you know he was coming?" "Of course not," Elena said, gripping the edge of the marble sink. "I don't know how he even found out about the wedding." Clara's expression softened slightly. "Are you okay? Do you want me to have him thrown out?" "Because I will. I'll cause a scene if necessary." "No," Elena said quickly. "That would only give him more power over the situation, make it seem like his presence matters." She straightened, meeting her reflection in the mirror. "I'm not going to let him ruin this day. I'm going to ignore him and focus on my husband." But ignoring Bruno proved harder than Elena had anticipated. He seemed to be everywhere she looked, at the edge of her vision, never quite approaching, but never quite leaving either. It was a psychological game, she realized, his presence a constant reminder of what they'd been, what she'd tried to leave behind. During dinner, Elena forced herself to focus on Mario's conversation with the couple seated across from them, to laugh at the best man's speech, to eat the expensive food that tasted like ash in her mouth. She was acutely aware of Bruno seated at a table near the back, barely touching his meal, his attention fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Elena," Mario said quietly, leaning close so only she could hear. "You don't have to pretend with me. If you need to leave, if this is too much—" "No," she interrupted, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry. I'm here. I'm present. He doesn't get to take this away from us." Mario studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay. But if you change your mind, we can slip out the back. Start our honeymoon early." He smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "I hear St. Lucia is beautiful this time of year." Elena returned his smile, grateful for his understanding, for the fact that he wasn't demanding explanations or making accusations. This was what she had with Mario: peace, understanding, the ability to simply be without constant drama and danger. After dinner came the first dance. As Mario led her onto the floor and the quartet began playing their chosen song, Elena finally allowed herself to relax into the moment. Mario wasn't a particularly graceful dancer, but he was confident enough not to care, spinning her gently and making her laugh when he missed a step. "Thank you," she murmured against his shoulder. "For what?" "For being exactly who you are." Other couples joined them on the floor, and Elena let the music and movement wash over her, finding a kind of peace in the simple joy of the celebration. She was married. She had built a new life, found a good man, created a future that didn't involve shadows and secrets. When the song ended, Mario was pulled away by his business partner for what was supposedly an urgent phone call. Elena made her way to the bar to get a glass of water, needing a moment to collect herself. "Congratulations." The voice came from directly behind her, and Elena didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She closed her eyes briefly, steeling herself, then turned to face Bruno Vieira for the first time in 3 years. Up close, she could see the changes in him. New lines around his eyes, a hardness to his jaw that hadn't been there before, and something haunted in his gaze that made her chest ache despite her best efforts to remain unmoved. "Thank you," she said, her voice cool and professional. "Though I don't recall you being on the guest list." "I wasn't," Bruno admitted. "I heard about the wedding through mutual acquaintances. I wanted to see for myself." "See what?" "That you were really happy, really moving on." Elena lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how much his presence affected her. "And what's your verdict?" Bruno's gaze traveled over her, the simple elegance of her wedding dress, the glow of happiness she'd been working so hard to maintain, the ring on her finger that proclaimed her belonging to someone else. When his eyes met hers again, she saw something crack in his carefully maintained composure. "He seems like a good man," Bruno said quietly. "Safe, uncomplicated. Everything I'm not. Yes, Elena agreed, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. That's exactly what he is. And you love him? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Elena thought about lying, about telling Bruno that she loved Mario with the same desperate intensity she'd once felt for him. But she'd built this new life on honesty, and she wouldn't start lying now, not even to protect herself from Bruno's scrutiny. I love him, she said carefully. Maybe not in the wild, consuming way I loved you, but in a way that's sustainable. That doesn't leave me feeling like I'm constantly walking on the edge of a cliff. He makes me happy, Bruno. He makes me feel safe. Something flickered in Bruno's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or regret. I should have fought for you, he said, his voice rough. I should have told Leon and everyone else to go to hell. Should have found a way to keep you without keeping you in danger. But you didn't, Elena replied simply. You made your choice. And now, I've made mine. Elena. He reached for her hand, then seemed to think better of it, letting his own fall to his side. I need you to know that ending things with you was the hardest thing I've ever done. That there hasn't been a day in the past 3 years when I haven't thought about you, haven't wondered if I made a terrible mistake. Don't, Elena said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts. Don't do this. Not here, not now. When then? Bruno asked, and there was a desperation in his voice she'd never heard before. You've moved on. You're married. There won't be another chance to tell you that I was wrong, that I was a coward, that walking away from you was the biggest regret of my life. Tears threatened, but Elena blinked them back. You don't get to do this, she whispered. You don't get to show up at my wedding and tell me you made a mistake. You don't get to make me question everything I've built when you were the one who destroyed what we had. I know, Bruno said, and the anguish in his voice was almost her undoing. I know I have no right. But I needed you to know. Needed you to understand that when I told you to forget I ever loved you, it was the biggest lie I've ever told. Elena? Mario's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He approached, his expression concerned but not suspicious, and Elena realized how it must look. Her and Bruno standing close together, both of them clearly emotional, the air between them thick with unspoken history. Everything all right? Mario asked, looking between them. Elena straightened, smoothing down her dress and forcing a smile. Yes, of course. Mario, this is Bruno Vieira, my former employer from Boston. He was just congratulating us on the wedding. Mario extended his hand, and Bruno shook it with the kind of professional courtesy that gave nothing away. Mario Suarez, pleasure to meet you. Congratulations, Bruno said, his voice perfectly controlled again. You're a very lucky man. I know, Mario replied, slipping his arm around Elena's waist. The gesture was protective without being possessive, a subtle claim that Elena belonged with him now. Bruno's gaze dropped to where Mario's hand rested on Elena's hip, and something in his expression shuddered. I should go. I've intruded long enough. He looked at Elena one last time, and she saw everything he wasn't saying in his eyes. Apology, regret, love that had come too late to matter. Goodbye, Elena, he said softly. Goodbye, Bruno. She watched him walk away, threading through the crowd of wedding guests toward the exit. With each step he took, Elena felt something loosen in her chest. Not grief, exactly, but a kind of bittersweet release. This was closure, she realized. The final ending to a story that had been left incomplete for too long. Are you sure you're okay? Mario asked, his voice gentle with concern. Elena turned to look at her husband, her kind, patient husband, who had given her space to heal, who had never demanded more than she could give. who loved her without conditions or complications. "I am," she said, and realized it was true. "I really am." The rest of the reception passed in a blur of well wishes and dancing and the kind of joy that comes from celebrating something real and good. When Elena and Mario finally left for their honeymoon, driving away from the restaurant in a car decorated with ribbons and trailing cans, Elena looked back only once. The restaurant was lit up against the darkening sky, full of people laughing and celebrating, and somewhere in that light and warmth was the ghost of what she'd once had with Bruno. Beautiful and intense, and ultimately unsustainable. She turned back to face forward, to the future she'd chosen, and didn't look back again. The honeymoon in St. Lucia was everything Elena needed. Lazy mornings in bed, long walks on pristine beaches, dinners overlooking the ocean as the sun painted the sky in shades of fire. Mario was attentive without being smothering, adventurous without being reckless, and Elena found herself falling more deeply in love with him with each passing day. On their fourth night, as they sat on their private balcony watching the stars emerge, Mario took her hand. "Can I ask you something? About him?" Elena tensed slightly but nodded. They'd been avoiding the topic of Bruno since the wedding, circling around it like a wound too tender to touch. "Do you still love him?" The question was asked without accusation, just honest curiosity. Elena considered lying, then remembered her commitment to building this marriage on truth. "Part of me always will," she said quietly, "not in a way that threatens what we have. But he was my first real love, and that leaves a mark." She turned to look at Mario, needing him to understand. "But what I feel for Bruno is in the past. What I feel for you is present and future. Does that make sense?" Mario was quiet for a long moment, then squeezed her hand gently. "Perfect sense. We all carry ghosts, Elena. What matters is that we don't let them haunt our present." The wisdom in his words, the complete absence of jealousy or possessiveness, reminded Elena why she'd said yes to this man. He understood that love wasn't about erasing someone's past, but about building a future strong enough to withstand it. They returned from their honeymoon to Providence, and the life Elena had built there. She went back to work at the library, threw herself into a new acquisition project, and settled into married life with surprising ease. Mario traveled frequently for business, but when he was home, they fell into comfortable rhythms. Dinner together when possible, quiet evenings reading in companionable silence, weekend trips to explore New England. 6 months into their marriage, at a gallery opening in Boston that Clara had invited them to, Elena ran into Leon Santos. Bruno's former right-hand man looked older, more tired, with new gray threading through his dark hair. He approached her cautiously, as if unsure of his reception. "Elena?" he said with a slight nod. "It's good to see you." "Leon." She kept her voice neutral, acutely aware of Mario standing beside her, of Clara hovering protectively nearby. "What brings you to Providence?" "Business," he said vaguely, "but I wanted to talk to you if you have a moment. Privately." Elena glanced at Mario, who gave her an encouraging nod. Clara looked less convinced but didn't object when Elena followed Leon to a quiet corner of the gallery. "I owe you an apology," Leon said without preamble. "For what I said to Bruno 3 years ago. For pushing him to end things with you." Elena blinked, surprised. "Why are you telling me this now?" Leon's expression was troubled. "Because I've watched what it did to him. The past 3 years he's been different. Colder, more reckless. He takes risks he never would have taken before, like part of him doesn't care what happens anymore." He met her gaze directly. "I thought I was protecting him, protecting the organization. But I was wrong. You made him better, Elena. You made him human." "Leon, I'm not asking you to do anything," he interrupted. "You're married. You've moved on, and that's good. You deserve happiness. I just wanted you to know that what I did, It haunts me, and it's destroying him. Elena felt something twist in her chest. What do you want me to say? That I forgive you? That I'll go back to Bruno and make everything better? She shook her head. I can't do that. I won't do that. I have a husband who loves me. A life that doesn't involve looking over my shoulder or wondering if today's the day someone uses me to get to Bruno. I'm happy, Leon. Really, genuinely happy. I know, Leon said quietly. I can see it, and I'm glad for you. He hesitated, then added, but if you ever want to know how he's doing, if you ever wonder, my number hasn't changed. After he left, Elena stood in the corner of the gallery trying to process the conversation. Mario appeared at her elbow, offering her a glass of wine. That looked intense, he observed. Elena accepted the wine gratefully. He wanted to apologize for his role in Bruno ending our relationship. And did you accept his apology? I don't know, Elena admitted. Part of me wants to tell him to go to hell, but another part understands that he thought he was doing the right thing, protecting Bruno the only way he knew how. Mario slipped his arm around her waist. You're allowed to be angry at him and understand his motivations at the same time. Life isn't neat enough to require choosing one or the other. Elena leaned into her husband's solid warmth, grateful for his presence, for the way he could see complexity in situations that others might view in black and white. Thank you, she murmured. For what? For being you. For not being threatened by my past, or demanding I pretend it didn't happen. Mario pressed a kiss to her temple. Your past is what made you who you are. I'd never ask you to deny it. As the months passed, Elena found herself thinking about Bruno less frequently, the sharp edges of what they'd had dulling into something more like nostalgia. She heard about him occasionally, through Clara, who still had connections in Boston, through news articles about the Vieira family's various business ventures, but always at a remove, like hearing about a character in a story, rather than someone who had once known her more intimately than anyone. She learned that Bruno had become more isolated, that he rarely appeared at social events, that the organization under his leadership had become more ruthless, even as he'd made some of its operations more legitimate. She heard rumors of increased violence, of territorial disputes settled with brutal efficiency, of a man who seemed determined to prove he was exactly what the world expected him to be. Part of her grieved for the man she'd known, the one who had collected rare books and made her laugh and shown her gentleness in private moments. But that grief was tempered by the knowledge that she couldn't save him, couldn't be the light that pulled him back from whatever darkness he was embracing. She had her own life to live, her own happiness to protect. 2 years after her wedding, Elena and Mario attended a fundraiser for the Providence Library. The event was held at a historic estate, and Elena wore a simple blue dress that Mario had helped her pick out. As they mingled with donors and board members, Elena felt genuinely content. This was her world now, these people who valued books and history and preservation. She was laughing at something one of the library trustees said when she felt it, that familiar, prickling awareness that meant Bruno was nearby. Elena's laughter died, and she turned slowly, scanning the crowd. He stood near the entrance, talking with the event coordinator. He wore a dark suit, and from across the room, Elena could see he'd lost weight, that there was a hardness to his features that hadn't been there at her wedding. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, and their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Elena saw recognition in his eyes, saw something that might have been longing or regret, but she also saw resignation, an acceptance that they existed in different worlds now, that whatever they'd had was truly over. Elena held his gaze for a long moment, then deliberately turned back to her conversation, back to Mario and the trustees and the life she'd built. It wasn't cruel, exactly, just a clear statement that she had moved on, that he no longer had the power to shake her foundations. When she glanced back toward the entrance later, Bruno was gone. "Was that him?" Mario asked quietly, having noticed the brief exchange. "Yes," Elena said. "But he left." "Good," Mario replied, not with jealousy, but with simple satisfaction that Elena's past wasn't going to intrude on her present. As the evening continued, Elena felt lighter somehow, as if that brief exchange had been another kind of closure. She had seen Bruno, had felt only a distant echo of what she'd once felt for him, and had turned back to her present without hesitation. That was growth, she realized. That was healing. The final ghost had been laid to rest. 3 years after Elena's wedding, Clara called with news that sent ripples through Elena's carefully constructed piece. "Bruno's getting married," Clara said without preamble, "to some socialite from a connected family. It's all over the Boston social pages." Elena was in her office at the library, surrounded by books that needed cataloging. She set down her pen carefully, processing this information. "That's good," she said finally. "He deserves to be happy." "Do you mean that?" Clara asked, skepticism evident in her voice. Elena considered the question honestly. Did she mean it? Yes, she realized with some surprise. Whatever complicated feelings she'd once had for Bruno Vieira had transformed over the past years into something more like distant goodwill. She wanted him to find what she'd found with Mario: peace, companionship, a reason to be better than the world expected. "I do mean it," Elena said. "He spent 3 years apparently making himself miserable. Maybe this will change that." Clara was quiet for a moment. "You're really over him, aren't you?" "I really am." It was true. Elena had built a good life in Providence. She and Mario were talking about starting a family, about buying a house with enough space for children and a library. She loved her work, loved the community she'd become part of, loved the quiet stability of a marriage built on mutual respect rather than desperate passion. Bruno belonged to a different chapter of her life, one that had closed completely. Several months later, Elena received an unexpected invitation to a symposium on rare book preservation being held in Boston. The event was sponsored by several prominent families, including the Vieiras. Elena's expertise with colonial-era manuscripts had apparently caught the attention of the organizing committee. "You don't have to go," Mario said when she showed him the invitation. "If it's too uncomfortable being back in Boston, around his world." "It's a professional opportunity," Elena interrupted gently. "And I'm not afraid of seeing Bruno anymore. That part of my life is over." Mario studied her face, then nodded. "Then you should go. I'll come with you. Make a weekend of it." The symposium was held at a prestigious private club in downtown Boston. Elena presented her research on preservation techniques for water-damaged manuscripts, fielded questions from colleagues, and networked with other archivists and historians. She was in her element, completely absorbed in discussing her work, when she sensed that familiar presence. Bruno stood near the back of the conference room, and beside him was a tall, elegant woman with perfect posture and a diamond engagement ring that caught the light. His fiancée, Elena assumed. They made a striking couple, both polished and powerful, the kind of pairing that made sense in his world. When Elena's presentation concluded and people began mingling, Bruno approached with his fiancée CDE on his arm. "Elena," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Excellent presentation. Your work with the colonial manuscripts is impressive." "Thank you," Elena replied, matching his professional tone. Up close, she could see that marriage or the prospect of it had softened some of the hardness she'd noticed at the Providence fundraiser. He looked healthier, more settled. "This is my fiancée 1CCE, Isabella Romano," Bruno continued. "Isabella, Elena Alves, formerly my head archivist." Isabella extended a perfectly manicured hand, her smile polite but assessing. "It's lovely to meet you. Bruno speaks very highly of your work with his collection." "The pleasure is mine," Elena said, shaking her hand. Congratulations on your engagement. Thank you. Isabella's gaze flickered between Elena and Bruno, and Elena saw the moment she recognized that there was history here, something unspoken, but significant. To Isabella's credit, she didn't become territorial or cold. Instead, she simply moved slightly closer to Bruno, a subtle claim that he belonged to her now. Bruno's hand came to rest at the small of her back, a gesture Elena remembered well, and she felt nothing. No jealousy, no regret, just a distant acknowledgement that he had found someone to fill the space she'd left. I should get back to my husband, Elena said, nodding toward where Mario stood talking with another presenter. But it was good to see you, Bruno. I'm glad you're doing well. You too, Bruno said, and there was a finality in his voice that matched the feeling in Elena's chest. Be happy, Elena. I am, she said simply. I really am. As she walked back to Mario, Elena felt the last thread connecting her to Bruno Vieira finally snap. Not with pain or drama, but with a quiet sense of completion. They had loved each other once, had hurt each other, had gone their separate ways. Now they were both moving forward with different people, different lives. The story was over. Mario slipped his arm around her waist as she reached him. You okay? Perfect, Elena said, leaning into his warmth. Ready to go get dinner? They left the symposium hand in hand, and Elena didn't look back. 4 months later, on a crisp spring morning, Elena stood in her bathroom staring at a positive pregnancy test. Joy and terror warred in her chest as she processed what this meant. She and Mario were going to have a baby, were going to become parents, were going to expand their quiet, stable life to include someone new. She told Mario that evening over dinner, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. Pure, uncomplicated joy. He swept her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time, already making plans for nurseries and baby names, and how they would balance work and parenting. As her pregnancy progressed, and Elena's body changed to accommodate new life, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The heartbreak with Bruno that had nearly destroyed her. The slow rebuilding in Providence. Meeting Mario and learning to love again. Differently but just as deeply. The gradual healing that had allowed her to see Bruno at various events without her world tilting off its axis. She had survived what she'd thought would kill her, had built something beautiful from the wreckage, had learned that there were different kinds of love and different kinds of happiness. On the day their daughter was born, as Elena held the tiny, perfect human she and Mario had created, she felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This was her family. Mario, their daughter Clara, named after her best friend, and whatever other children might come. This was her happiness, earned through pain and patience and the courage to try again after devastating loss. If she thought of Bruno at all in those early days of new motherhood, it was only to feel grateful that their story had ended when it did. She couldn't imagine this life, this beautiful, messy, joyful life, if she'd stayed in Boston, trapped between love and fear, waiting for a man who could never fully commit. She had chosen herself, had chosen the possibility of something better, and the universe had rewarded that choice. Years passed. Clara grew from infant to toddler, to a bright, curious child who loved books as much as her mother. Mario's business continued to thrive, and Elena eventually took a position teaching archival studies at Brown University, finding joy in passing her knowledge to the next generation. She heard about Bruno occasionally, through news articles, through Clara's continued connections in Boston. He had married Isabella, had a son, had successfully transitioned more of the Vieira empire into legitimate business. By all accounts, he was happy, or as happy as a man with his history could be. Elena was glad for him, in the distant way you're glad when someone you once cared for finds their path. But mostly, she didn't think about him at all. Her life was full of Mario's laughter, and her daughter's questions, and her students' enthusiasm, and Sunday dinners with friends, and the quiet joy of a marriage built on honesty and respect. She had everything she needed, everything she'd ever really wanted. On the 10th anniversary of her wedding to Mario, as they sat on their porch watching Clara play in the yard, Mario took Elena's hand. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked, the question coming from nowhere. Elena considered it, really considered it. Did she regret loving Bruno? No. That love had taught her what she needed, what she didn't, who she wanted to be. Did she regret the pain of that ending? Not anymore. It had led her here, to this porch, this man, this life. "No regrets," she said, squeezing Mario's hand. "Not a single one." And as the sun set over Providence, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elena meant it with her whole heart. 5 years after her wedding, Elena stood in the nursery of their Providence home, watching her daughter Clara sleep. At 3 years old, the little girl had inherited Mario's warm brown eyes and Elena's honey blonde hair, a perfect blend of both parents. The room was painted a soft sage green, filled with books and toys carefully chosen to nurture curiosity and imagination. "She's out cold," Mario whispered from the doorway, coming to stand beside Elena. His arm slipped around her waist with the easy familiarity of years together. All that running around at the park finally caught up with her. Elena leaned into her husband's warmth, grateful for these quiet moments. Their life had settled into comfortable rhythms. Mario's business trips were shorter now, scheduled around Clara's milestones and family dinners. Elena had been promoted to lead curator at the Providence Library and was publishing articles on manuscript preservation that were gaining recognition in academic circles. They had purchased this house 2 years ago, a Victorian with good bones and enough space for the family they were building. "I got an interesting call today," Mario said as they moved to their bedroom, closing Clara's door softly behind them. "From the Symposium Committee in Boston. They want you to keynote next year's conference on colonial document preservation." Elena paused in the act of removing her earrings. "In Boston?" "I know it's complicated," Mario said carefully. He had long since stopped dancing around the topic of Bruno, treating Elena's past with the same straightforward honesty he brought to everything else. "But it's a huge professional opportunity. The symposium is the most prestigious in the field." Elena considered this, examining her own reaction. 3 years ago, even the thought of returning to Boston for an extended period would have filled her with anxiety. Now she felt only a mild trepidation, the kind anyone might feel about revisiting a place associated with old pain. "I'll think about it," she said finally. The timing would be good. It's not until next fall after Clara's birthday. That night, as Mario slept beside her, Elena lay awake thinking about Boston. The city where she'd fallen in love, where she'd learned the difference between passion and stability, where she'd left behind a version of herself that no longer existed. She wondered if Bruno still lived in the penthouse, if he still collected rare books, if his marriage to Isabella had brought him the peace he'd seemed to be seeking. Then she wondered why she was wondering at all. The decision to accept the keynote invitation came gradually, after discussions with Mario and her department head at the library. It would mean a week in Boston, 3 days of conference presentations, workshops, and networking, followed by a long weekend visiting Clara, who had been asking about the city where Mommy used to work. "Are you sure about this?" her friend and colleague asked over coffee one afternoon. Not Clara, her friend from Boston, but Melissa, a fellow archivist who had become close over the years. "Emotionally, I mean. Going back can be harder than you expect." "I'm sure," Elena said, and realized she meant it. "That chapter of my life is closed. Bruno Vieira is just someone I used to know." The words felt true as she said them, which was its own kind of victory. September arrived with its promise of changing leaves and crisp air. Elena packed carefully for the Boston trip, professional clothing for the conference, casual outfits for the weekend with Clara and Mario, who would join her after the symposium ended. She brought the presentation she'd been refining for months, printed materials for the workshop she'd be leading, and a small photo of her family that she always traveled with. The conference hotel was in downtown Boston, a modern glass structure that bore no resemblance to any place she'd been with Bruno. Elena checked in, unpacked in her efficient single room, and tried to ignore the flutter of nerves in her stomach. This was work, nothing more. The fact that Bruno's city sprawled beyond the hotel windows was irrelevant. The first day of the symposium passed in a whirlwind of presentations and conversations with colleagues from across the country. Elena delivered a well-received talk on moisture damage in 18th century manuscripts, fielded thoughtful questions, and accepted invitations to collaborate on future research projects. By the time she returned to her hotel room that evening, she was exhausted and satisfied, having nearly forgotten to worry about unexpected encounters. The second day brought a surprise she should have anticipated. Elena was examining a display of preservation tools during the afternoon exhibition when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Miss Alves, I thought that was you." She turned to find Leon Santos standing there, looking older but not dramatically changed. His dark suit was impeccable, his expression cautiously friendly, his eyes assessing her with the same shrewd intelligence she remembered. "Mr. Santos," Elena replied evenly, recovering her composure. "I didn't expect to see you here." "The Vieira Foundation is one of the symposium's primary sponsors," Leon explained. "I'm here representing our interests in historical preservation." He paused, then added, "You look well. Happy." "I am," Elena said simply, seeing no reason to elaborate. Leon glanced around the crowded exhibition hall, then lowered his voice slightly. "Would you have coffee with me? Just for a few minutes. There's something I'd like to discuss." Every instinct told Elena to refuse, to maintain the careful distance she'd built between her present and her past. But curiosity won out, and 15 minutes later they sat in the hotel's coffee shop, watching conference attendees stream past through the glass walls. "How is he?" The question emerged before Elena could stop it, surprising them both. Leon's expression softened with something like relief, as if he'd been waiting for permission to discuss Bruno. "Surviving." The marriage to Isabella lasted 3 years before they divorced. Amicable enough. They wanted different things. She's remarried now, very happy by all accounts. Elena absorbed this information, feeling nothing but mild surprise. "And Bruno?" "Focused on legitimizing the family business," Leon said. "He's largely succeeded. The Vieira empire is mostly above board now. Real estate, import-export, venture capital. He's become something of a philanthropist, actually. The foundation does good work with historical preservation and arts education." "That's good," Elena said, meaning it. "I'm glad he found a constructive path." Leon studied her carefully. "He asks about you sometimes, not often and never directly, but I know when he's wondering how you are, if you're happy." "Why are you telling me this?" Elena asked, not unkindly. "Because I owe you honesty," Leon replied. 3 years ago, when I saw you at that gallery in Boston, I apologized for my role in ending your relationship with Bruno. But I never told you the whole truth." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I told Bruno that you were a distraction, a liability, I wasn't wrong about the danger, but I was wrong about something more important." Elena waited, letting the silence encourage him to continue. "I was afraid," Leon admitted, "of what loving you was doing to him. Bruno Vieira, the man I'd known since childhood, the man who made decisions based on strategy and never on sentiment. He was changing, making choices based on what would make you happy rather than what would strengthen his position. And I thought that made him weak. But you were wrong." Elena supplied quietly. I was catastrophically wrong, Leon said, his voice heavy with regret. Loving you didn't make him weak. It made him human. It gave him something worth protecting beyond power and territory. When he lost you, when he chose duty over love because I convinced him it was necessary. He broke off, shaking his head. He survived it, but something in him broke that never quite healed. Elena felt an unexpected ache in her chest, not for herself, but for the man Bruno had been, the one who had collected rare books and made her laugh and showed her tenderness when no one else was watching. I appreciate you telling me this, she said finally, but it doesn't change anything. Bruno made his choice. I made mine. We're both living with the consequences. Are you happy with your choice? Leon asked directly. Elena thought of Mario, of Clara, of the life they'd built together brick by careful brick. Yes, she said with complete honesty. I am. My husband is a good man who loves me without conditions or complications. My daughter is healthy and bright and brings me joy every single day. I have work that matters, friends who care about me, a future that doesn't involve looking over my shoulder. So yes, I'm happy. Leon nodded slowly. Then I'm glad, and I hope... He hesitated, then continued. I hope someday Bruno finds that kind of happiness too. So do I, Elena said, and realized she meant it. They parted cordially, Leon returning to his foundation duties, and Elena to the symposium. But the conversation lingered in her mind through the afternoon workshops and the evening reception. She wondered about Bruno's divorce, about what he'd been doing for the past 5 years, about whether he'd truly found peace in his new legitimate empire. Then she called Mario from her hotel room, heard Clara's excited chatter in the background, and remembered that these were idle curiosities, nothing more. Her life was in Providence now, not in the past. The final day of the symposium brought the keynote addresses. Elena delivered hers in the main ballroom to an audience of nearly 300 preservation professionals, academics, and private collectors. She spoke about the intersection of science and art in manuscript conservation, about the responsibility of preserving history for future generations, about the delicate balance between access and protection. The presentation was well received, earning enthusiastic applause and several standing ovations. During the question and answer session, Elena fielded inquiries with confidence and grace, her expertise evident in every response. She had prepared for months, but more than that, she had lived this work for years. It was hers in a way nothing had ever been hers when she was with Bruno, earned through her own effort, untainted by association with his name or his power. After the session ended, Elena was immediately surrounded by colleagues wanting to discuss collaboration, students seeking advice, collectors hoping to hire her consultation services. She worked the crowd with professional warmth, handing out business cards and accepting invitations to upcoming conferences. It was in this swirl of congratulations and networking that Elena felt it. That familiar, prickling awareness she'd learned to recognize years ago. She looked up and found Bruno Vieira standing near the back of the ballroom. He wore a dark suit, his hair now distinctly threaded with silver at the temples. Even from across the room, she could see he'd aged in the 5 years since her wedding. New lines around his eyes, a leanness to his face that suggested weight loss through stress or deliberate discipline. He stood with perfect stillness, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that transported her instantly back to that library where everything had begun. Their gazes locked, held for a heartbeat, and Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Not because old feelings resurfaced. They didn't. But because she suddenly understood with perfect clarity that some connections, once forged, never completely sever. They might fade, might transform into something unrecognizable, but they never entirely disappear. Then someone asked her another question, and Elena turned back to the conversation, deliberately choosing to focus on her present rather than her past. When she looked toward the back of the ballroom again several minutes later, Bruno was gone. That evening, as Elena packed her conference materials and prepared for Mario and Clara's arrival the next day, her phone rang with an unknown Boston number. "Hello? Elena." Bruno's voice was exactly as she remembered, that slight rasp, the careful control, the undercurrent of something deeper. "I'm sorry to call unexpectedly. I got your number from the conference directory. I hope that's all right." Elena sat on the edge of her hotel bed, processing the surreality of this moment. "It's fine. What can I do for you?" "Your keynote was exceptional," Bruno said. "The work you're doing, the research you've published, it's brilliant. You've become exactly what you were meant to be." "Thank you," Elena replied, keeping her voice professionally cordial. "I'm proud of the work." A pause, filled with unspoken history. Then, "Would you meet me? Just for coffee, just to talk. I promise I won't take much of your time." Every rational instinct told Elena to refuse. She was happy, settled, had no business reopening chapters that had closed years ago. But something in his voice, not desperation exactly, but a quiet honesty that she remembered from their best moments together, made her hesitate. "My family arrives tomorrow," she said finally. "I don't have much free time." "An hour," Bruno said. "That's all I'm asking. There's a cafe 2 blocks from your hotel, tomorrow morning before your family gets there. Please, Elena, there are things I need to say." Elena closed her eyes, weighing the decision. Mario would understand. He always did. And she was curious, she had to admit. Curious about what Bruno needed to say after all this time. Curious about whether seeing him again would hurt, or simply feel like encountering a stranger who happened to share her history. 9 o'clock, she said. "The cafe you mentioned. 1 hour and then I need to go." "Thank you." The relief in his voice was palpable. "I'll see you tomorrow." After disconnecting, Elena sat for a long moment staring at her phone. Then she called Mario, because their marriage was built on honesty, and she wouldn't start keeping secrets now. "That's fine," Mario said when she explained about the coffee meeting, his voice warm with trust. "You're allowed to have closure conversations with your past. I'm not threatened by a man you haven't been with in 8 years. "I love you," Elena said, grateful for his steadiness, for the security of knowing she could tell him anything without fear. "I know," Mario replied, "and I love you. But Elena, be kind to him. Whatever he did, however it ended, he's clearly still carrying it." "How do you know?" "Because men don't track down their ex-lovers at professional conferences 8 years later unless they're still carrying it," Mario said simply. "Just remember, you're not responsible for fixing him or absolving him. You're only responsible for being honest." Elena thought about that after they hung up. She wasn't responsible for Bruno's healing, hadn't been even when they were together. That was a lesson it had taken her years to fully internalize, that loving someone didn't mean sacrificing yourself to save them. The next morning dawned gray and threatening rain. Elena dressed carefully in jeans and a simple sweater, casual but put together, neither trying too hard, nor not caring at all. She left the hotel at 8:45, giving herself enough time to walk the 2 blocks and arrive precisely on time. The cafe was small and unpretentious, the kind of place that served good coffee to neighborhood regulars rather than tourists. Bruno was already there, seated at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. He stood when she entered, a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy that made her think of all the small ways he'd once tried to show respect. "Thank you for coming," he said, as she sat across from him. "I wasn't sure you would." Elena accepted the coffee he'd ordered for her. Oat milk latte, her preference, which he somehow still remembered. "You said you had things to say." Bruno studied her for a long moment, and Elena let him look, secure enough in herself not to need to fill the silence. She saw him taking in the changes, the confidence in her posture, the wedding ring on her finger, the peace in her expression that had been absent when they were together. "You're happy," he said finally. "Really happy. I can see it in your eyes." "I am," Elena confirmed. "I have a good life. Bruno. A husband who loves me. A daughter who's the light of my world. Work that fulfills me. I'm happy." Something passed across Bruno's face. Grief, perhaps, or acceptance. "I'm glad. Truly. You deserve that happiness." He paused, then added, "Leon told me he saw you yesterday. Said you seemed settled, at peace." "Leon talks too much," Elena observed mildly. A ghost of a smile touched Bruno's lips. "He does, but he means well." The smile faded. "Elena, I asked you here because I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the inadequate words I've rehearsed in my head for 8 years." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said gently. "What happened between us, it was complicated. We both made choices." "No." Bruno's voice was firm. "I made choices. I chose duty over love, fear over courage. I chose to believe that keeping you meant destroying you, when the truth was that letting you go destroyed something in both of us." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "I was wrong, Elena, about everything. About what you needed, about what I was capable of giving, about whether love was worth the risk." Elena felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Bruno." "Let me finish," he interrupted. "Please, I've been rehearsing this for years." He took a breath, choosing his words with visible care. "When you left, I told myself I'd done the right thing, protected you from my world, from the danger that comes with my name. I threw myself into work, became colder, more ruthless. Leon told you about Isabella, I assume." Elena nodded. "I married her thinking I could build something new, something uncomplicated, but it was a mistake from the beginning. She was lovely, intelligent, deserving of someone who could love her fully. But I couldn't, because part of me was still in that library, still watching you walk away, still wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." "Bruno," Elena said quietly, "you can't blame yourself forever. You made the choice you thought was right at the time." "That's just it." "I didn't think it was right," Bruno said, his voice raw with honesty. "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid. Afraid of what loving you meant, of the vulnerability it created, of how much power you had to hurt me. So I hurt you first, convinced myself it was noble when it was really just cowardice." Elena absorbed this, seeing the truth of it in his haunted eyes. "What do you want from me, Bruno? Forgiveness? Absolution? Because I can't give you those things. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a long time, but I've moved past it. But I can't absolve you of your choices any more than I can change what happened." "I know," Bruno said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for you to know the truth, that ending things with you wasn't about protecting you. It was about protecting myself from the terrifying reality of how much I needed you." He ran a hand through his silver-threaded hair. "And I want you to know that I'm glad you're happy. Genuinely, deeply glad. Your husband is a lucky man, and I hope he knows it." "He does," Elena said softly. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 8 years settling between them. Elena realized this was closure, real closure, the kind that comes from honesty rather than silence or anger. "What about you?" she asked. "Leon said you're doing well with the business transformation, but are you happy?" Bruno considered the question seriously. "I'm at peace," he said finally. "Which isn't quite the same thing as happy, but it's more than I had when you left. The business is legitimate now, or as legitimate as something built on my family's foundation can be. I've made amends where I could. I sleep better at night." "That's good," Elena said, meaning it. "I'm glad you found a path forward." "Elena." Bruno hesitated, then continued. "When I saw you at your wedding, saw how you looked at your husband, I realized I'd never seen that expression on your face when you looked at me. Not love, exactly, but peace, trust. The security of knowing someone wouldn't ask you to be anything other than who you are." Elena thought about this, about the difference between what she'd had with Bruno and what she had with Mario. "We were intense," she acknowledged. "Maybe too intense to be sustainable. What I have with Mario, it's quieter, but it's real, and it's built on foundations that won't crumble." "He's a good man," Bruno said. "I looked into him after your wedding, not to interfere," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "Just to make sure you were safe, that he was what he seemed." Elena should have been angry at this invasion of her privacy, but she found she couldn't muster the energy. "And your verdict?" "That he loves you the way you deserve to be loved," Bruno said simply. "Without conditions, without shadows. I'm glad you found that." Elena glanced at her watch. They'd been talking for nearly an hour, and Mario and Clara would be arriving at the hotel soon. "I need to go," she said, gathering her purse. "My family is waiting." Bruno stood when she did, years of ingrained courtesy overriding the informal setting. "Thank you for meeting me, for listening." "Take care of yourself, Bruno," Elena said, and she meant it with her whole heart. "Find someone who makes you happy. You deserve that too." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her one final time. "Elena?" She looked back. "For what it's worth," Bruno said, his voice carrying 8 years of regret and hard-won wisdom. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Even though I couldn't hold on to it, even though I let fear win, knowing you, loving you, it changed me in ways that probably saved my life. So thank you. For 2 years of being seen, of being loved for who I was rather than what I could do or control. Thank you for that gift." Elena felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since sitting down. "You're welcome," she whispered. "And Bruno, you gave me gifts too. You taught me what I needed, what I didn't, what I deserved. Without you, I wouldn't have recognized it when I found it." She left then, stepping out into the gray Boston morning with tears on her cheeks and a lightness in her chest she hadn't expected. The conversation had been painful but necessary, a final closing of doors that had remained cracked open for too long. By the time she reached her hotel, the tears had stopped, and she felt strangely cleansed. She had seen Bruno, had heard his apology, had offered her own kind of closure. And it had changed nothing about her love for Mario, or her commitment to her family, which was exactly how it should be. Mario and Clara arrived an hour later, her daughter rushing into Elena's arms with excited stories about the train ride. Mario caught her eye over Clara's head, asking a silent question, and Elena nodded. "I'm fine. We're fine." That afternoon, they visited the Boston Children's Museum, where Clara delighted in the interactive exhibits and Mario indulged her every whim. Elena watched her husband and daughter together and felt a rush of gratitude for this life, these people, this love that required nothing of her except that she show up honestly. On their last evening in Boston, as they walked through the public garden with Clara running ahead to chase ducks, Mario took Elena's hand. "How was it?" he asked. "Seeing him?" Elena thought about the question, about Bruno's apology and her own sense of closure. "Sad," she said finally, "but necessary. He needed to say what he said, and I needed to hear it. But it didn't change anything important. You're still my husband. This is still my life. He's still just someone I used to know." Mario squeezed her hand. "Good. I'm not the jealous type. but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little concerned. You never have to be concerned, Elena assured him. What Bruno and I had, it was real, and it mattered. But it ended for good reasons. What we have is built on better foundations. They watched Clara splash in puddles, her laughter carrying across the park. Elena thought about different kinds of love, about passion versus peace, about the choices that shape our lives. She had loved Bruno Vieira with desperate intensity, had learned from that love, and had survived its ending. She loved Mario Suarez with steady warmth, built a family with him, created a future that didn't involve fear or shadows. Both loves were real. Both mattered. But only one was sustainable. Only one allowed her to be fully herself, without reservation or hesitation. As they left Boston the next day, Elena looked out the train window at the city receding behind them. Somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and history, Bruno was living his life, carrying his regrets, finding his own path to peace. She wished him well, truly and completely. Then she turned back to her daughter's coloring book, to her husband's crossword puzzle, to the ordinary beauty of a Sunday afternoon with her family, and didn't look back again. The past was finally, completely, irrevocably past. And Elena Suarez, no longer Alves, no longer defined by what she'd lost, but by what she'd built, was finally, completely free.